Here's my second video of Sergeant Pepper commentary. Now, the first video was originally 30 minutes long, and I figured, well, that's too long. I'm going to edit it down to 13 minutes because under 15 minutes is the easiest way to upload videos to YouTube. And then I realized I cut out so much important information that I decided I better make some more videos to include some of that information. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. This one's called How Sergeant Pepper Influenced Music. Now, everybody knows that Sergeant Pepper is one of the most famous albums of all time. That's part of how it influenced music. But what were some of the specific things that amazed other artists in the music world that made them want to either do stuff like Sergeant Pepper or stuff just inspired by the spirit of Sergeant Pepper, which was the spirit of creativity and exploring beyond the orange pylon that ropes us into a box of formulas that we need to break out of. Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the album that came out in 1967, was a radical departure from previous Beatles albums, but it was also a departure from all the norms of the music world. For example, most albums back then were promoted by singles that were played on AM radio. But the Sgt. Pepper album didn't have any singles on it. Even though it had great songs, and all the songs could have been singles, I think. In other words, played on top 40 radio. Even A Day in the Life could have been played on top 40 radio, and maybe a bunch of those stations did play it back then. Just like a bunch of stations played Sgt. Pepper's and With a Little Help from My Friends, the opening tracks. But it was just unconventional at that time to put out an album without a single. And then it goes on to be this huge album anyway. Of course, the Beatles already had big name recognition by 67 since they came on the American scene in 64 and were big in Europe since 62. So they had a lot of familiarity already, where they had developed a huge fan base that allowed them the liberty to do that. Now, the songs Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane were originally intended for the Sgt. Pepper album, but they were left off the album because it was released as a double A-sided single in February of 67 while they were still recording the rest of the album, and the label wanted a single or something to put out, because it had been a while since the Beatles. It had been several months, and back then several months was like today's several years in the music world. So that's what happened. That's why Sgt. Pepper did not include Strawberry Fields, which was the first song recorded for the album, but it was left off so that it could be its own single leading up to the album. And then All You Need Is Love was a single recorded in that era, but it wasn't on the Sgt. Pepper album. But they ended up, all the songs I'm talking about, Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane, and All You Need Is Love, they all ended up on the Magical Mystery Tour album that came out in the following, at the end of the year of 1967. So another way Sgt. Pepper influenced the music world was that it just had a wide array of instrumentation. I mean, you had the harpsichord on Fixing a Hole, and then the harp, which is more the acoustic instrument used in classical music, on She's Leaving Home. And you just had all these other instruments that just hadn't been in Beatles songs before. So it just broadened their sound. And it made, I think, a lot of musicians want to adopt that broad sound for their albums, at least back in that era. Another way the album revolutionized music was basically the way it was recorded. It was recorded over several months instead of how albums used to be recorded, kind of like live performances that didn't really take too long. It usually took a couple weeks to do those albums. But Sgt. Pepper took several months, and it actually ran up a huge studio bill, which raised the bar for a lot of musicians in that era. It made recording a lot more expensive, but let's face it, Sgt. Pepper was worth it. But that doesn't mean all the albums that tried to copy Sgt. Pepper were worth it. So hopefully people will take that into consideration and not necessarily want to drain their life savings on recording unless they have something as special as Sgt. Pepper. But how often does that happen? I mean, Pink Floyd came out with some stuff, but then again, they were recording at Abbey Road Studios where the Beatles recorded, and at the time it was called EMI Studios. Another way that Sgt. Pepper influenced the music world was that all the songs flowed together like a continuous stream, at least on each side of the album. You had to flip over side one to side two, of course, back then on vinyl discs, but I mean, still, it was like listening to like a freeform radio program. So that was a unique feature for its time. And then the other thing that's actually probably most talked about, at least by rock critics, is that it was considered the first concept album. Now, there may have been albums before that were based on a concept, especially movie soundtracks. But those don't count because those were made for movies, right? Sgt. Pepper was not a movie, at least not at that time. So it was the first standalone kind of concept album, at least based on my memory off the top of my head in all my research. But I could be wrong. Some people might consider Beach Boys albums concept albums. Some might consider earlier Beatle albums concept albums, like Rubber Soul. Kind of is a concept. It's an earthy album, and that's kind of the theme that runs through all the songs. It's a more stripped down, less produced album. And then Revolver might be considered a concept album. It just depends on how you define concept album. I don't think the Beatles really set out to make a concept album when they did Sgt. Pepper. I think that, and that's based on the interviews and just what I've read about people who knew the Beatles and what they said about it themselves. So there's a certain accidental quality to it being a concept album. And to me, the concept of the album is either, there's several, I mean, there's a billion ways to describe it, but one, of course, is I'd love to turn you on, which is a lyric in A Day in the Life. And some people might consider that the theme of the album, about turning on not just individuals, but culture with inventive, innovative imagery. Is kind of what it is. I mean, the album cover gives you a lot of imagery. It's very cultural because it has a lot of famous people on the cover. And another concept that you might consider is that it's about illusions. A few of those songs at least talk about illusions. I mean, A Day in the Life is all about, you know, the imagery of death and then where it takes us and what we think about death and how kind of like the shock that comes with death, and then how sometimes people are just numb to that and then they turn their minds away from it, and like turning off reality and then going back into their world of illusions. That's kind of what I get out of A Day in the Life. It's kind of an ambiguous song though, because Not all of it ties together into one neat theme. It's kind of like a lot of different things mixed together. In fact, it's two songs mixed together. It's John's song and then Paul's middle part thrown in. Another song that deals with illusions is Within You, Without You. We were talking about the space between us all and the people who hide themselves behind a wall of illusion. I love singing those lyrics because they just seem to mean so much, and they make me think of so many things at one time. It's a deeper consciousness song for sure. So deeper consciousness might be a concept that you would consider defining that album. Fixing a hole, that's about, I guess that's an optimistic song. So optimism might be another theme. Cultural optimism might be a theme to Sgt. Pepper. Starts off with the crowd sound effects, and it turns into this party, and it takes you through all this imagery that's good-natured and friendly and just good vibes. Another concept you might consider for Sgt. Pepper is that it's all about how far you can go with imagination. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is an imaginary band, so that might be the concept of the album. There's so many different book reports you can write based on Sgt. Pepper. I know in college I wrote one, and it was more about how it was coinciding with the Age of Incoherence, which was the name of a course I took at Sacramento State University. And Age of Incoherence was really about pop culture, but it was about how tradition was coming apart and just the counterculture was changing things. So it's also a counterculture snapshot. So there's lots of things you could talk about. There's a military theme that runs through the album, and it could be looked at from different viewpoints. Sgt. Pepper is about a military character, and then Lovely Rita talks about how the bag across her shoulder, or the cap and the bag across his shoulder made her look like a military man. And then we have the Sgt. Pepper reprise near the end. And then in A Day in the Life, it talks about how the English army had just won the war. So disillusion might also be a theme to the album, since it's all about turning away from things. At least some of the songs are. At the end of Within You, Without You, there's laughter sound effects. So that's kind of interesting that you have this deep song that ends in laughter and then segues into When I'm 64. Lots of different themes to consider. One of the most important, though, is that it's a continuous album, at least on each side. So there's my review of how Sgt. Pepper affected the music world.